So first, I want to thank so many of you for being here, for traveling a very far distance from Lisboa, from Bolzano, from Roma, from Brescia, from all of these wonderful places. Second, I want to thank the students for being here. I met some of you in the class of Davide De Maio, and it's lovely that you're here. I'm just honored that you would come. I think some of this might be a bit of repetition for you, but maybe the second time around it's a little bit more clear. Third of all, I would like to thank, and most importantly, is Carlo for organizing all of this, for bringing me here, for letting me have the contacts with Professor De Maio, and for such a wonderful conference. I'm deeply honored. Second time in Verona, hopefully. If the talk is good, it's not the last, yeah. And then I will say finally, before I begin, that to come in the talk after Professoressa Napolitano is a little bit like, the metaphor is someone blows up the balloon and I like let it out and the air is coming out of the room now. It was a brilliant talk, and to come after you is like we go downhill now a little bit, so maybe not as good. But with that I begin. So the talk is Will in Modern Germany. So I recently wrote a book called Philosophy of Will, which tries to reconsider the development of 19th century German philosophy in terms of several thinkers, both well-known and relatively unknown, who espoused an all-encompassing theory of systematic philosophy of what the will was, what it operated, what it affected. And the figures I mean are Goethe, Schelling, Schopenhauer, Edward von Hartmann, Julius Bunsen, Philipp Meinlander, and of course Nietzsche. And my argument there is that through them there was an interconnected and successive series of systematic philosophies of will that presented alternatives to the materialism-idealism debates in responding to the advances of the natural sciences. And these philosophies, I think, are historically interesting, but more than that, they represent philosophical systems that are more than merely romantic or speculative. What they present are legitimate theories by the criteria of today's naturalistic philosophy or philosophical naturalism. Now, although each thinker is a distinctive philosopher, what theoretical tenets unite these thinkers as a genuine philosophical tradition are the following. First, that will is only understood problematically. We have no direct access. That will is not a rational faculty or a power of deliberation, as it is in the Greeks, for example. Will is not something of which we are usually conscious. Will is not something that we can control. Will is best characterized as competitive striving. Will is operative in both the organic and inorganic nature. Will is the measure of normative value, which we'll get to in a moment. Will is the mover of social and political activity. Will is ultimately what we are, and will is ultimately what reality is. So, as Carlos said, it's a massive book. The manuscript was almost 1,000 pages. This is the thing. 10 points if you don't want to read that terrible thing. Just read that. So too long, didn't read. There we are. But these theses are not exactly terribly orthodox in today's professional academic philosophy. The overarching reasons why I take it is that such theses represent an older, speculative, romantic, single explanation metaphysics that is no longer acceptable under the criteria of philosophical naturalism. But I think there are three, wrong one there, like that. There are three major criticisms which, by means of briefly mentioning these thinkers over the course of the lecture today, I am going to try to answer. So, three criticisms. The first is up on the top right there, single principle explanations of metaphysical reality, like will, violate Karl Popper's criteria of falsifiability. For example, if every X is said to be will and no X is not will, then it is not possible to falsify a universal claim about X being a case of will by pointing to some other X that is not will. So this is trivially different, to explain it, than falsifying the claim all animals on the farm are chickens by pointing to a cow on that farm. Right? That's different than what we have with will. Therefore, you can't point to something that is not will. Second, scientific explanations that employ will generally violate Rudolf Carnap's concept of verifiability with respect to the meaningfulness of propositional statements. For example, what are the truth conditions to determine the veracity of a claim that that was an act of will? Contrast this, I think, Sophia, might be with neuroscience, where conditions for determining whether an electrical chemical impulse occurred are or are not clearly stated. Third, will has been superseded. Thank you, Federica. Federica has an exam. Good luck. Will has been superseded by genuine explanations, since will does not solve problems in a way that has pragmatic value. So if I say, for example, that an unconscious will to do X is replaced by neuroscientific explanations involving falsifiable and quantifiable activities in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, or the basal ganglia, psychoanalytic interpretations of what an unconscious willed were readily replaced by a pharmaceutical industry that could operate in the language of neurotransmitters and neuropathology. So, like I said, I think these three are the best objections to the historical philosophy of will. If these criticisms are right, then the philosophy of will is neither falsifiable, verifiable, or useful, and can be dismissed without further investigation as to whether or not the theory is true. It would be, as someone like Brian Leiter has claimed and has told me very forcefully on many occasions, a just crackpot metaphysics. You'd have to be crazy to hold something like this. So Leiter says that about Nietzsche, and Leiter says that about me, so that's fine. Good company. Now, needless to say, I don't think this is a good criticism. In this paper, what I want to do is to show what motivated the theory of will in late modern Germany by giving sort of a taster test of the theorists and the problems that they were trying to solve. What emerges will, I hope, suggest that even if the theory may not be considered a convincing explanation of reality, it is nevertheless not crackpot or absurd. It's a worthy historical consideration and a legitimate philosophical conception. Now, the theory of will, at least as the 19th century would come to understand it, very different than the ancient world, very different than the medieval world, was actually, bless you, the inspiration of Goethe. Now, what united each of the polymath's exercises was his conviction that growth was the essential characteristic of all living things, all phenomenon of the mind, and even all inorganic objects. In fact, it is a misnomer, or at least an infelicitous way of speaking, even to refer nominally to things or phenomena or objects. For Goethe, a thing is what it does, and what it does is grow. The pattern of growth that we observe is the entirety of a thing's identity, and where growth follows a roughly similar pattern, we identify those patterns as species or genera. Now, when it grows, what is called a thing does not stop at a stage of dormancy or crystallize into some permanent state. Whether a stalactite, a flower, an embryo, a thing grows out of itself and into itself as a newly intensified form. Intensification, his word was Steigerung, even manifests in the chromatic scale of colors as they move from darker shades to lighter shades. All things become what they are by means of competition between opposed active forces that constitute that thing as that thing. When the leaf stretches upward and turns towards the warm sun, the stem extends roots down further into the cool darkness. The stalk becomes more robust as the outmost fronds become more refined, and so on with the rest of nature. If a thing grows by competitive active forces that operate unconsciously as it works to intensify itself, and if that is all a thing is, then we might say, not Goethe's word, but my own, that the thing is will. Will is purposive, competitive, unconscious movement in regular patterns. And if a science of nature would be true to nature, its job would be to recognize the expression of will in the objects of its investigation. So, for example, the work of the botanist is more than counting the number of petals on a rose stem. It is to trace the morphological growth of an individual according to a regular typology, the will to manifest what Goethe calls an Urphänomen. The gentle empirical scientist sees this with careful observation, where Enlightenment empiricists like Carl Linnaeus in botany or Isaac Newton in optics, where they got science wrong was in treating observation like an artificially present tense. Linnaeus's botanical classification system, where every organism is classified by its quantifiable characteristics in a mature state, ignores entirely how a thing grew to be the kind of thing it was. Newton's artificial color experiments with prisms produced colors so constant and pure that nature herself never knew them. Goethe, on the other hand, claims to be able to see these compensatory changes empirically, everywhere, where they take place over time. His theory, then, is not speculative. His theory is firmly naturalistic. Now, let's grant Goethe's morphological observation for the moment not as true, but as something more legitimate than merely the romantic speculation of a romantic poet. Issued first in 1790, it presented a single comprehensive principle by which to naturalistically describe the processes that scientists do in fact experience, not artificial constructions of light like Isaac Newton, but light as it really does change throughout a natural day. Not artificial botanical diagrams, but real organisms as they're found growing and decaying in nature. Even if it was published after Kant's theory of dynamical matter in 1786, just 4 years after that, Goethe discovered it as a natural scientist does, not needing the transcendental idealist's regulative als ob to identify a purpose. Purposive growth in regular patterns is empirically and not just regulatively assertable. Goethe's morphology precedes Hegel's phenomenological insistence on regulative patterns of maturing intensification in the mental realm, too. It precedes Darwin's vision of the organism's plasticity in adapting to hostile forces over time. And it precedes, by more than 1 century, Freud's insistence that the health or sickness of an organism was an epiphenomenon of the kind of relationship between the hostile and unconscious forces that compete within the individual. Goethe's conception of growth, I'm not saying it's right, but it was and it is a legitimate philosophical conception that was grounded in the naturalistic observation and intended to solve meta-scientific problems that philosophers of his days encountered. Now, so much for Goethe. Although their connections are understudied, Goethe had 2 very important philosophical protégés, among many other protégés, Schelling and Schopenhauer. Both at times and in their own ways were devoted like sons to the fatherly Goethe, and both actually lived in his house for times. Both would wrestle with the specifically metaphysical implications of Goethe's theory of growth, and both would name the single metaphysical reality of the world in response to Goethe, will. Wollen ist Ursein, said Schelling, and die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung, said Schopenhauer. So let's start with the former. Schelling was more the transcendental philosopher than Goethe, and sought to explain through both a Naturphilosophie and an Identitätsphilosophie the logical conditions for the possibility of what living growth Goethe had, through the languages of the specific scientists, described. In both nature and the mind, no static things persist, only competitive polarities that are enacted through typological actants. As the magnet is the activity of polar forces and nothing more, so subject and object, matter and spirit, indeed everything real, is the consequence of a fundamentally dynamic ground of nature, the absolute, the unconditioned, conditioning totality, what he once called will. Nature is alive, and it breathes in and out as a harmony of competitive actants. Now, that all seems romantic and speculative enough, but while Schelling was inclined towards mysticism through his connections with Baader and Bohme, his theories were remarkably fecund for the then burgeoning fields of dynamic chemistry, electromagnetism, and ecology. Of the first, Schelling thought that instead of little bits of matter interacting with one another, what really happened in chemistry was the dynamic interaction again of opposed forces, which even today bear his division between positive and negative charges with respect to ionic bonds. Schelling's own disciple, Hans Christian Ørsted, would famously show that electricity and magnetism were polar expressions of a single electromagnetic field, both of which were further subdivisible into actively moving polarities. And with respect to ecology, the belief that nature is a single self-organizing whole that expresses everywhere, that growth by competition, that is a single, interconnected, dynamical, biological, and botanical whole. That notion of ecology largely originates with Schelling's Naturphilosophie. Whether or not it's the true way to conceive of nature, it has been a fruitful one. Whether he may have been guilty of meaningless or unfalsifiable terminology, well, he's at least in good company. Schopenhauer continued Schelling's Goethe's work too. His dissertation was on the logic of explanation, noting specifically that natural explanations based in empirical judgment required the at least unconscious experience of motion. For Schopenhauer, you can only see what moves, not the object, but only light hitting the object in a particular way at a particular moment. You only hear what moves. You don't hear a person, but only the person as it's moving through a particular space at a particular moment. You don't smell an object, but only the object when the sweaty t-shirt moves around a bit. Where there is no movement for Schopenhauer, there can be no experience. Therefore, our experience of the world, and indeed all that we can legitimately think about the world, is a world that is moving. Time and space are then merely forms of experience, nothing real in themselves, because time and space are the subjectively ideal conditions by which we cognitively individuate objects in the world. That particular sound, that particular smell, any speculation about what the world would be like if we could suspend our cognitive faculty for a moment would be a non-individuated singularity that was nevertheless always moving. Now, not within space and time, not in any direction or for any duration, but a motion everywhere and nowhere equally, without a recognizable beginning or end, just ubiquitous action without spatial direction or temporal succession. This pure, unconditioned activity is what natural science calls force, Kraft, or energy, Energia. But there is a deep problem with the notion as science treats it. The genius of Newton was to quantify force in terms of its relation to mass and acceleration. The genius of Einstein would be similar. Energy can be quantifiably equated to mass multiplied by the square of the coefficient of the speed of light. The crowning achievements of theoretical physics would be to quantify that, of which the entirety of reality they think is constituted. But however certain and however practical this accounting task is, what force is, what energy is, in itself no scientist can name. We don't experience it, don't define it, and don't really bother trying to understand it itself. Only its measurable effects, its consequences. But what if there was an experience of force or energy? This is why Schopenhauer's theory of will was not speculative. Science considers force and energy from the outside, as it were, as an external object of experience. But Schopenhauer, on this score, was more of a naturalist than the physicists. He intuited that if we are ourselves of the self-same stuff that reality is comprised, then indeed the experience we have of ourselves is of the self-same stuff as that of the inside of every object within the universe entirely. The division between subject and object falls away. This is what he calls the secret path inside the otherwise impenetrable castle wall presented to external experience. Our apprehension of ourselves is consistent with what could possibly be apprehended of the inside of reality. If science from the outside represents force or energy, then from the inside, that same reality should be designated by what most immediately and most irrefutably appears to our inner awareness, namely our willing. Inner awareness, if you think about yourself, there is no static self, but always motion, motion toward and motion away, or put in the words of our inner psychology, desire and aversion. In short, willing. I ask again, is this idle speculation? Or is this consistent with scientific naturalism? Is this a meaningless or unfalsifiable expression? Or is it indeed the most immediate experience we can have of ourselves, that of wanting and not wanting, craving and avoiding? It seems we can, really can, falsify his theory about introspection if we could find a genuine inner awareness of a non-volitional movement. And it seems we can verify it by recounting all those clearly volitional aspects of our everyday inner awareness. If so, and if we are indeed beings entirely consistent with the rest of natural reality, then the theory of will from Schopenhauer is admittedly very strange, but not an illegitimate theory by the criteria, again, of philosophical naturalism. Well, after Schopenhauer, there were three metaphysically inclined disciples who have today been almost entirely forgotten. Part of my book's effort was to revitalize these thinkers by showing the cogency and influence of their thinking. The first is Edward von Hartmann, whose beard was as glorious as his theories were terrible. The picture behind that is actually the family picture of von Hartmann when he was in school. Very ugly man, very ugly family. That's all a joke, but that's Darwin or something, right? Hartmann was a critical reader of Darwin, one of the first critical philosophical readers, in fact. His main work comes 2 years after the publication of The Origin of Species. His life project was to incorporate the theories of Schopenhauer, Schelling, and Hegel together with Darwin by means of, and he coins this term, he is the progenitor of this term, Unbewusstsein, the unconscious. What Schelling and Schopenhauer pointed to but never did name was that the manifestly self-organizing character of all living things through a competition repetition of aimed forces was the work of this Unbewusstsein, this unconscious. One sees immediately the corrective of Darwin here. Evolution, which, by the way, as a concept bears many of the same faults about verifiability and impracticality that beset the concept of will, holds several distinct problems for Hartmann. Among them, first, is that the inordinately long, millennia-long process of biological adaptation seems belied by the rapid and almost immediate adaptations most organisms enjoy. Second, Darwin's world is a passive world, where the success or failure of an organism seems an accident that works out well or else works out poorly for it. As such organisms ourselves, we like to think our successes and failures have something to do with our own agency. Third, Darwin's world is an individualistic world and a direct world where an organism responds to its own environment. But as any ecologist knows, there are far wider and far less direct natural systems at play at every level of organic development. Fourth, for Darwin, all of the extraordinary organization and mutually dependent systems of nature are just matters of accident. But whether accident can explain the ubiquitous and regular development of uncountable trillions of organisms, their organs, their societies, their very cellular structures, that has been for Hartmann, a tenditious assumption. Finally, there's the question of why. Darwin may have been the single most exhaustive researcher who ever lived, but he resisted speculating on why things should evolve in the first place, waving his hands at God's providence, but little more. Well, Hartmann did not wave his hand. Hartmann's answer is that an unconscious will aims at unconscious purposes of nature at all levels. Organisms, from protoplasms to people to polar bears, do what they do in a way that clearly indicates the self-organization and striving for greater resources. It's not a happy accident that white blood cells destroy a viral cell, nor a happy accident that polar bears enjoy the taste of fish, nor that human intelligence levels have broadly increased over the last several thousand years. It's because each of these strives for or wills that end, even indeed when they cannot cognize that end. Hartmann's favorite example, you can maybe see the background, is of the male praying mantis. I love this example. The male praying mantis, you know what these are? These are these little green bugs, you know? It allows its female mate to bite its head off and eat its brain in order that their potential offspring may have a bit more dietary fatty acid. The male, now, without its brain, without its head, actually finishes the act of copulation. That hardly seems like an accident. That hardly seems to work out well for the male, at least. Hardly seems an expression of the reflective drive to survive. And I'll add this, it's a very poor dating strategy. You know? You just shouldn't do that. You bite the head off your mate, just leave them alone, you know? Yeah, just terrible. This is an organized, deliberate, something one member of a species does so that a yet-to-exist member of that species may grow a little stronger. Now, unless we imagine that this headless praying mantis, who in the throes of copulation is actually quite intelligent and extraordinarily self-sacrificing, foreseer of the future direction of its species, well, that's what Hartmann means when he says an organism unconsciously willing an unconscious idea in nature more generally. Is that theory crazy? Probably. And Hartmann, believe me, actually gets much crazier than that. But he's making a striking contribution to evolutionary science here. Organic structures really do display astonishing functional integration in ways Darwin never imagined. The eye, the immune system, the nervous system are not merely put together in a way that organization can seem to follow from them. They're organized for ends. End directedness is not merely a regulative supposition. It is manifest to natural observation that organisms are will, a competitive field of strivings with built-in ends, even when no conscious purpose is in sight. And evolutionary biologists today operate with that very presumption, and accordingly can model all of what Hartmann was saying with gene, morphogen gradients, and dynamical systems. No matter the level of the organism, the qualitative pattern remains one of self-organizing striving, never passive random accidents over vast spans of time. Now, Philipp Meidlander, the anniversary of whose suicide was the 150th anniversary of whose suicide was just April 1st, a few days ago, was another disciple of Schopenhauerian philosophy of will, and another who was kind of buried by more orthodox philosophers for what was called mystical speculation. As with Hartmann, there is a mystical side of Meidlander's thought. He posits non-allegorically a metaphysical one that wills its own dissolution, which act gradually accounts for the multiplicity of reality. It's a bit like Plotinus, in fact. You have a one that emanates into all of the particular things in this universe. But this sort of theosophical speculation aside, Meidlander is simultaneously trying to respond philosophically to what was arguably the most momentous discovery of theoretical physics in the later 19th century. Rudolf Clausius postulated that heat was no thing, but the epiphenomenon of moving particles. And Schopenhauer would certainly have agreed with that. The problem was that heat inevitably dissipates when particles slow. Clausius discovered that heat never moves from a colder body to a warmer one, and he discovered finally that all of that movement and all of that heat was gradually but inevitably slowing down. The essential characteristic of the universe was not Isaac Newton's harmony of forces, it's instead entropy, which is what that picture is showing. Now you can already predict where this is going. Meidlander thinks entropy is no accidental circumstance. The universe wills to unravel itself. Meidlander thinks will is directed motion, pattern movement, unconscious aiming at an end so regular that it is the universally inextricable cosmic fate. That's what will is, a Wille zum Tode, or will to death. Now, if the classical mechanics of Newton, which champion harmony of complementary forces, regular and perfect and calculable, led to the kinds of stable systems of normative values, and indeed political unions that the Enlightenment so proudly trumpeted, then what if that was all wrong? Instead of a physical world of stable harmony, what if we had a universe of instability, held together only for a moment before the spinning top spins itself slowly out? What should our values be if reality is entropic? For Meidlander, instead of finding our suitable place within the harmony of nature, the best thing for us to do would be to end the whole parade of existence. Beyond even suicide, which he committed, we should remain forever abstinent. For Meidlander, in place of a democratic union where each voice is considered part of a harmonious choir of government, we should resort to socialism, which strives for nothing special, produces nothing enduring, but at the very least seeks to alleviate suffering as far as possible. Meidlander was a Schopenhauerian socialist. Who'd have thought? As before, Meidlander's system is hardly likely to win adherents, but there are, it seems to me, two reasons to take him quite seriously. Like the rest of the philosophers of will, his system is not idle curiosity, but an attempt to take seriously the science of his day. It underscores the unity of nature and the human person. It highlights how values should be grounded in reality, and it accounts, in a way Hegel never could have, for the regular corruption of culture, societies, and nations. Meinlander rejects the Hegelian and indeed the Marxists' hope in a higher synthesis, a more perfected state, acknowledging the stark reality that cultures, religions, nations, societies, indeed most everything in life, begins with a strong, centralized unity and gradually dissipates and disintegrates into a sad state of eventual nothingness. If will aims to death rather than life, Meinlander thinks we should face that natural fact of existence rather than try in vain to escape it. Now, the last thinker I wanted to mention is Julius Bunsen. He's probably the hardest thinker to unriddle, and not just of the neo-Schopenhauerians, and I would say not just of German philosophers. His writing, for those brave enough, is a remarkably stylized abuse of the human power to communicate. And that's intentional, as Bunsen rejects the principle of identity, he rejects the law of the excluded middle, and he rejects the principle of non-contradiction. Each of those is merely a human pretension aimed at logically ordering what is an essentially contradictory state of reality. And the fact that human beings try to understand and control logically a reality that is itself illogical is itself an illogical activity. Logic is illogical. An attempt to tame a tiger by pretending it's a kitten. Now, denying that there is a single will, Bunsen sees that everywhere and always a multiplicity of contradictory wills seem at play in nature and within the person. Matter and force are not two things in some relationship, but contrary wills that require understanding in terms of the other, even while it is said to be the contrary of the other. Negatively charged electrical and chemical ions requires relation to positively charged ones for not only their comprehensibility, but also for their very existence. An acid in chemistry is only acidic in the context of basics. Centripetal force always meets centrifugal force. One without the other, one without its contradiction is not only inconceivable epistemologically, but would collapse into implosion or explosion so immediately that the force itself would be immediately a non-force. What lives is always dying. What attracts simultaneously repulses pride and guilt, the tragic and the comic, the number 0. There is no synthesis to a higher state. There is no redemption, even in Meinlander's vision of absolute death. For Bunsen, there is ever only contradiction. That is reality, and that is our lot. Now, is Bunsen's philosophy true? I'm not sure he thought it could be. But like the other theories, Bunsen's will to contradiction makes an important philosophical impact. Consider the massive advance in quantum mathematics and physics in the 20th century. If there's a unifying theme, it's that the principle of identity, so thoroughly presumed in classical mechanics, is, well, suspect at best. There is good scientific evidence for both string theory and grand unified theory, even though they're contradictory. There is good evidence that a quantum object is both a particle and a wave. Quantum systems exist in a superposition of all possible states, for example, multiple places at once. However, when observed, they collapse into a single state. While quantum mechanics is non-local in terms of instantaneous connection, relativity is local. Events are connected only through space-time proximity. While the mathematical formulation or wave function evolves deterministically, the outcomes of measurements are fundamentally probabilistic. To put a point to all of it, all cats, not just Schrödinger's cats, are both alive and dead. If quantum theory in physics asks us to accept contradiction and paradox and indeterminacy as essential features of reality, then it seems Bunsen's philosophy of will is not only in good company, but was in quite prescient. Now, I know we are running late on time, so I'm not going to discuss Nietzsche's theory of the will to power. I think you all here know it well enough to obviate my own explanation here. You do, right? All I will say is that it's hopefully apparent that Nietzsche was no singular genius oracle of the will, but someone who was working within what was then an established tradition. Those who would dismiss it as a crackpot metaphysics, like Brian Leiter, simply don't understand the context in which it was posed. I've tried to show instead that most theorists of will were in fact naturalists, thought it could be proven empirically, were consistent with the natural sciences, and were in fact trying to solve problems left over from specific sciences. And I've tried to show here that their theories were remarkably fruitful in physics, botany, ecology, evolutionary biology, dynamic chemistry, neuroscience, and psychology. Can any 19th century theory claim such practical application to the natural sciences? I don't think so. A theory's value, I think, cannot be pinned to whether or not it is true, whatever that means. I think it matters more to ask what it illuminates, what problems it can make clearer, and what new puzzles arise from it. For those reasons, I think philosophy of will is a legitimate theory, one that does deserve far more philosophical attention than it has previously enjoyed. So with that, I thank you for your attention here. Whoops, I missed Bunsen, sorry. Oh, I missed 3 slides. Oh, I'm so sorry. We leave it here. Thank you very, very much. I think I ran very late. There was some Bunsen there, yeah. Yeah.
So time for questions. I have so many of them. I think I will restrain myself for lunch. Okay, 3 questions. Ladies first. Sophia. I don't know. Ma serve per la registrazione. Sì.
Okay.
Recordings.
Thank you. That was fascinating, and I mean, I know very little about these things, so thank you so much for illuminating me. So I think you're right about falsifiability and verifiability, because I think they are very disputable principles themselves. They've been abandoned, so probably it's not that important. Even if the theories you have presented would contradict these principles, maybe it's not a big problem in itself. So I think you're right. But I was wondering about another kind of possible objection to the notion of will, which might be framed in terms of the Occam's razor. So one may say, I mean, of course, these philosophers may have given great contribution or may have had great insight about key notion, like the idea of different theories contradict themselves, the idea of instinct, all the things you have mentioned. But still, we don't need the concept of the will to explain all these things. We may have the good things of these philosophers without the need to introduce a specific concept of the will. Like, for instance, yes, of course, there are contradictory theories in modern physics. We don't know how to merge them. So it is even possible that the laws of nature are contradictory in themselves, like ontologically, not just epistemically. But why the need to introduce the will? Or I was fascinated in particular by Hartmann's view about this weird combination of Darwinism and idealism. Yeah, that was very strange. But yeah, I mean, we can have all the very interesting things he says without the need to postulating a will, or in Lander's view about the fact that the universe will collapse at some point, that we are going towards entropy. This might be very true, but still we don't need a will that is conducing all these things. So if we don't need it, then we have to remove it just for the Occam razor. So, I mean, even without being reductions.
Yeah. So thank you, Sophia, very much. So I think that the answer to the question is, I worry more about them being too agreeable with Occam's razor. And why I think they are too agreeable is because, and this is fundamentally Goethe's point, is the unity of all of nature. What is going on inside of you is what's going on with evolution and quantum physics and Schrodinger's cat and all of these other things. What they're looking for is a single principle to explain that. So right now, I think theoretical physics don't say, well, okay, there's these quantum realities and there's a superposition and observation and things like this, but they're not making comments about like how you make political judgments, right? How do you say, well, I'm going to vote for this candidate or that candidate? So you need two principles at the very least, right? How you choose what to eat, how you choose, a potential person to have children with, things like this. These you need multiple principles for. And the easy thing, which I think is a little bit too reductive, I think I worry about that, is that they only need one. And it's the exact same principle that operates in you as you decide what you want to eat today, as that is deciding for why entropy in the universe works. So that satisfies Occam's razor very easily because you've only got one principle to explain everything. For me, that's the problem, though, is that I actually have sort of problems with Occam's razor and that are a little bit far afield. I think there's reasons to hold it, but those reasons aren't necessarily logically valid. But I think they're too grounded in Occam's razor, and that I think reality does demand far more multiplicity of explanation, especially with human agency. These guys want to all just reduce it into one principle. So it's an interesting problem. I think it goes too far the other direction, though. Yeah, please. Yeah. Yeah.
Some of the evolution, like Darwin and the others, they explain basic things that Hartman explains without the need to build. So in that case, it's not needed. In the case of difficult to apply in principle, exactly, this is not satisfying.
Yeah. So to answer that, I think Hartman would say, when Darwin's going to say that things slowly evolve and it does so quite accidentally, and that any patterns that emerge are patterns that human beings project on what actually was just an accident in nature, you still have the problem of that doesn't explain why I do the things that I do. And so this is why I think Darwin says very little about human agency and human desires and wills. He says very little about that because you need a completely different principle to explain how change happens when I desire to change it. For him, it's, these sort of grand systems that take place over hundreds of thousands of years, but it's all accidental. It's very passive. Hartman's saying, well, no, I think Darwin was wrong with the passivity. You only need one principle. I will to do these things unconsciously, and so does the plants that become different species over 10,000 billion years or something. So I think, again, that sort of satisfies that one principle, even on that level with Hartman. So, but thank you for that. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Tony. I look forward to reading Leiter's review of your handbook, by the way. I have one comment and two questions. The comment, is a quick comment. As you know, I work on Schopenhauer and suicide, and I experience exactly the same thing. Schopenhauer has a very rich phenomenology of suicide, which is completely ignored in the contemporary debate because of his metaphysical context. And the argument goes that, if you take out the argument from the context, then it doesn't make sense, and this is completely wrong, so I sympathize with you. Two questions. So what about I'm really interested in one of the first point you mentioned, namely namely will as a measure for normative values. One very trivial objection would be, what about the naturalistic fallacy or the Aesop problem? There will be, so do you have an answer for that, or do you think the objection doesn't apply? And the second question is more specific. I've been working for many years on Nietzsche's metaethics. And as you know, on the one side, Nietzsche says that there are no absolute values. Values are perspectival. Then in the Antichrist 2, section 2, he says, what is good? Good is what enhances the will to power. So how do you reconcile this ancient and anti-naturalism with naturalistic realism?
Perfect. Yeah. Perfect, Paula. Thank you very, very much. Those are both great questions. I do address both of these at some length in my book, so I will just sort of recite what I said there. The naturalistic fallacy is very interesting because it does presume that there are sort of two orders, the order of valuation and the order of factual description, right? So the is-ought problem is sometimes called. So what is the case, namely entropy, right? If science is right, there is an entropic universe, then what should I do, right? What ought to I value? And if the is-ought problem is right, the answer is that doesn't help you at all. And practically speaking, of course, it's a bit silly to say, well, the universe will pass away in 300 million years. Therefore, what should you do tomorrow? How should you vote? Like, I'm not going to worry about the heat death of the universe because it's 100 trillion years from now. So practically speaking, not just logically, it's a silly thing. So how I think they get around it is by denying that there is a division between is and ought, right? So what there is always will, and there is that matter of valuation. So how you are constructing reality, this is, I think, very clear in Nietzsche, how you are constructing reality, how you are saying this is what there is the expression ultimately of your value system anyway. So when you say there is will to power, or all there is will to power, that's not a factual description that is somehow completely distinct from the valuative or normative order. I think that is the expression of his normative order. That's his criticism, I think, of the Stoics in Beyond Good and Evil, where he says, oh, you noble Stoics, this is the world, therefore this is how you ought to value. And he's saying, no, what you say the world is the expression of your value. So I think that's how to escape the is-ought problem, is to collapse it. Right? There are other ways as well, but that's, I think, the best answer they give. They give a few other ones too. As to your second question, how will to power can be itself an absolute valuation, even though there are no absolute valuations. So this is a little bit like Paul Katsafanas, who I know you know, is the constitutive theory. So there's a first order willing and a second order willing. Right? So if I say I will to eat something, that's the first order. But ultimately, why I will to eat is the second order, because I have more power, or I have the concomitant feeling of being empowered when I successfully eat. So if I eat, if I buy some pants at a lovely store, if I spill some wine, if I meet somebody that's beautiful, if I win political office, if I, whatever it is, all of these are different values. So there's nothing absolute, they're all diverse. But the successful achievement or the successful exercise of any one of those contributes to the expansion of my feeling of power. That's that pleasure principle. So then he can say, as a meta principle, a meta valuation, power is always the second order concomitant value of any first order valuation. So that's why I think he can say power is always valuable, but it's because the attainment or the exercise of any individual thing, winning the race, racing itself, reading the book, writing the book, the power that you get from doing that is always the thing that you're aimed at as a second order valuation.
Each takes that involve power as a basis for all others.
Yes, right. So it's whatever contributes to your feeling of empowerment is the justification for why what gave you the feeling was valuable. So in other words, if you are not, but if you are a greedy person, getting more money is valuable, but why? It's because it increases your feeling of power. So your value for money is derived from your value for power. That's, I think. Does Nietzsche spell that out? Not really, but that's my interpretation of it anyway. But yeah, thank you. We talked more too.
Yeah, just very briefly. Thanks so much for that great presentation. You can hear me. I have to do like this. No, the topic is that in many cases, most of all what you were dealing with Goethe, you were somehow saying that lot of stuff you find there, you can find it in Darwin, you can find it in, let's say, neurological approaches later on. And so there is a way by means of which this wheel, you try to demonstrate that it's not so crazy what these guys are saying, because you find, let's say, a lot of proofs, even in a different way with different perspectives that somehow are repeating the topic. And that could be, I think it's very reasonable. I'm very much on the very same metaphysical level. But exactly for this, I would say, why just not saying that this wheel you are accounting for as a proper metaphysical reality that does not need to be, let's say, proven later on by neurobiological or, let's say, Darwinistic or whatever approaches, because what we call the metaphysical ground, and that will be the Nietzschean approach. Also, when you were saying, very interesting, the list at the beginning, organic and inorganic is the force, which is permeating of itself all reality. If we do agree that this has an ontological reality, then we have to figure out the structure, the functioning, how it's organized in clusters, in shapes, in what we want. And we find a lot in that time. Think of people like Killmeyer, for example, Schelling, even people that are not mentioned here for a reason of time, of course. But there is a way to give to this reality a fundamental, a fundamental level of reality again. And that would be the metaphysical approach, because if we buy the other way around, that we have to demonstrate that this metaphysical ground is also proven later on in other fields, is like assuming that properly it's metaphorical in a way, but I don't think that's the strength of your piece of reasonment, whereas I really feel that that could be a way to testify that it's a fundamental reality in itself.
Really great question. It becomes a question of the motivation and whether the motivation sort of succeeds in showing what I want to show. So what I want to show, you said it in very nice words, was that these guys aren't crazy. Yeah, that could have been the subtitle of the book. But the motive for doing that is to show that in the context of, well, there are later thinkers and contemporary thinkers that sort of are doing something that could use this as a metaphor in the same kind of way. Now, the weakness of that is that that doesn't prove that any of this is true. It just proves that it might be popular. It might prove that it might have an association, but that, so to your point, you're saying, well, why not do this strictly as the more metaphysical approach? And I do that in my book. My motivation here today was a little bit more, first of all, expositional, because while I'm sure everyone here knows Goethe and Schelling and Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, the three minor figures I think are really, really understudied. So there was part of my motivation was just to expose this. The other part of the motivation was to respond to especially Anglo-analytic critics of the metaphysical tradition as such, because what they want to do is to say, well, there's all of these speculative theories, they're wonderful, they're imaginative, Hegel, I mean, brilliant, but who cares? No one did anything with it. These are people that are very analytic reductive, especially in Cambridge, it's just that kind of philosophy. In America, it's almost only that. So I know that I am among friends here who want to say, well, no, there's a legitimate 19th century tradition of metaphysics, but the way that I'm trying to speak more to those people who are these analytic reductionists is by using the language of Popper and Carnap and even William James, is to say, well, the value of a theory is the falsifiability, the verifiability, the practicality of that thing. I think all of these guys start with a metaphysical proof. The only one that I talked a lot about was, for example, Schopenhauer's. Right? So Schopenhauer's metaphysical proof, I think in the Anglophone analytic tradition, they just think he went outside one day and looked at the moon and said, well, there must be this will. It's like, no, that's not what he did. Right? He actually has a really good reason for thinking that the basis of reality has to sort of be somehow underneath what Kant was talking about. And I think that's a good proof. But the Anglophones don't really care about that. They just want to see, well, does it allow us to speak with the natural sciences? And does this allow ultimately for us to get like grant money? Because I can say, that, oh, look, I'm talking about the theory of entropy here, really. So physicists have some grant money. So yeah, to your point, theoretically, I completely agree with you. As a moment of just practical necessity, when you're trying to defend people like Schopenhauer or Nietzsche or Hartmann, certainly, to figures like Brian Leiter or the Anglophone tradition, the way to do that, the strategy, is by showing how actually grounded in the sciences they were and how naturalistic their theories were. So that was why I took that approach. But to your point, yeah, certainly, metaphysically. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Are there more questions?
We have time, was it? Oh.
Scientific level of your conscious by Freud, the scientific level.
Yeah. Oh, yes, absolutely.
You think, okay.
No,
I articulate my question.
In Italiano.
No, no problem. It was very interesting to see these connections every time between the philosophers you have explained and the scientific fundaments on the other side. And my question, as you have told, you treated the unconscious sometimes, which is, in your opinion, the scientific level of Freud's theory of unconscious? This is my question.
So there's a very direct link, in fact. So, oh, no, but so Hartmann is a very, very, very interesting figure. He's written these massive books, and he tries to prove all of this biologically. And he has this biological proof that's 500 pages long with hundreds of examples. He's about 2 generations before Freud. He had extremely few students because he had a very difficult time walking around, and so he couldn't be a university professor. He was bedridden most of his life. But one person that came to visit him for about 6 months was Leo Breuer, who was Freud's teacher. So Freud's teacher for 6 months, towards the end of Hartmann's life, studied with him. So there's a clear connection there. So Hartmann tries to do it with biology, whether how scientific that is, but he also tries to do it with St. Augustine, with Plotinus. He tries to do it with these figures too, and say that there is this unconscious idea, because he believes that nature does evince purpose. The problem is that purposes are mostly unconscious. So I consciously have a purpose to speak into the microphone, but unconsciously my hair is growing, right? My digestive system is working. I don't control that. I don't know about that. And I can maybe think about that, but I don't know the mechanism even. So his point, Hartmann's point, is that it's not only that you don't know how to control it, you don't know even possibly the mechanism by which it could be controlled. He says that's a good reason why you know it's an unconscious thing. Now, as an adjective, there was all sorts of unconscious acts. And one could say, like, I mean, you had the unconscious acts in your paper. But he thinks the unconsciousness is a thing, is a reality. It is scientifically, the world is the unconscious. And it is not just that you have an unconscious and I have an unconscious. There's only one, the unconscious. Die metaphysische Unbewusstsein, right? There's only one. And that one unconscious, you can call that God if you would like, that unconscious leads you to do all of the things that you do and all of the things that I do. And if we have a little quarrel, it's not to your benefit or to my benefit, but it is to the benefit of the world. So when species go extinct or when species come together, all of these acts that all of the spiders and the snakes and the ants and you and I and everyone else do is for the benefit of all reality. So because of that, it's this incredible system of fatalism and pessimism that you can never control your actions. You are always being controlled. And it is never for your happiness. That's where it's different than like Christian theory that says, well, yes, God is looking out for you and has, some control in your life or something, but it's for your benefit. For Hartmann, no, it's for nature's benefit. And if we have to go extinct, then we do that for nature. That's his point. Crazy. He's crazy. Yeah, we hope. Yeah. So, but yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.